Hello, I am giving you a lecture that I am calling Emily Dickinson, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Revolutionary Women and Traditional Women's Arts in America. Women have done more than you know. Um, Here is a very sort of fanciful picture of Betsy Ross in Rays of Sunshine showing George Washington and others the new flag, George Ross and Robert Morris. This is an entirely apocryphal event. We have no reason to think that those men sat there while she unfurled the new flag. But I basically heard a similar legend to the one that this depicts, that the men of the revolution that started this country made all the big decisions and thought of all the big thoughts and did all the big things. And, well, Betsy Ross sewed the flag, but the men were the ones doing all the heavy lifting without exception ever. Um, my high school lied to me about the ladies. Look at this woman. Doesn't she look tough? Meet Margaret Corbin, who fired the cannon into the redcoats after her husband died, saving the Continental Army from defeat. Literally, she was near enough to know that her husband had died while he was manning the cannon, and she just took over his place, even though she did so at clear risk to her life. Another woman named Deborah Sampson changed her name legally to a man's name and enlisted in the Continental Army. She fought in the Battle of Brooklyn. The Continental Army won that battle, and she was wounded in the battle by gunfire. She was legitimately an infantry person, and she was not the only woman to disguise herself as a man and run off and join the actual Continental Army, though she is the one that is best documented. Other women simply fought in their own communities with guns they had on hand. Basically, if you were in a family that had decided to rebel in any way, your husband could get hanged as a traitor, and men came to your door in red coats demanding to see him, you might just as well shoot him as look at him in the middle of that war. Also, I want you to remember that the English quartered soldiers in American houses against the household's will, and who better to fight through things like poison and cutting of throats than the lady of the house who had access to the food and the things they used to chop up cows before they cooked them. Women fought with guns, women fought with knives, women fought with poisons, women were spies, all in the American Revolution. And you've clearly heard of the Boston Tea Party, men disguising themselves rather lamely as Native American Indians and throwing all the tea off the ship in Boston Harbor, a significant Revolutionary War moment. This is a bit of a cartoonish painting of Abigail Adams. I mean, I like the dress on her, but she looks a little Disneyfied there. But in her diary and letters, she reports a coffee party. There was a coffee shipment into Massachusetts. The taxes were extraordinarily high, and one merchant was planning on being a war profiteer. And the women demanded that he lower his prices to normal levels. He refused, making fun of the women. So they took guns and commandeered the cart and confiscated the coffee for the revolution and threw the man into the mud. That has only recently been documented in history books, but it has indeed been authenticated. After the revolution, women were sent back to their traditional domestic occupations and excluded from men's endeavors. Women couldn't go to college. Women couldn't join the army. Women couldn't go into traditional trades that men did, but women weren't slackers. Where they could influence, they did. You've heard of Dolly Madison. There's like a whole I guess, sort of like donut company named after her. And for years, she was simply remembered in history books as a nice Washington hostess, but it's more complicated than that by a lot. The people of her time knew her to be a much more canny political figure. She wasn't just a lady who was nice. Um, she had no official title in her husband, President James Madison's White House. The idea of a first lady having an official role was pretty much invented by her, and she did a lot more than be the first person to serve ice cream at the White House, and indeed she was that. Um, there was gridlock in Washington. Does that sound familiar? The men simply refused to agree on anything who were the elected officials. So Dolly Madison knew this was both bad for her husband's career and bad for the country. So she took it upon herself to use her social connections with the women of Washington, whose husbands were elected officials, and collectively they, with private conversations in homes, uh, carefully negotiated an end to the gridlock. And at the time, the men acknowledged that she had played some role in this, although that particular activity was largely subsumed into her just being popular and calling on the ladies for fun in the neighborhood. But that's not what was going on. She was negotiating politically in a way that the men refused to. And very bravely, during the War of 1812, she refused to flee the White House. Her husband fled, and maybe he needed to. But the British Army literally set the White House on fire above her head. And she managed to save George Washington's portrait, the one that still hangs out in Washington. And that's brave. And again, people, this painting is in her very old age, as you can see. She in her youth she was young and considered quite pretty. Um, uh, but when she died, Congress actually declared a national day of mourning, something that happens only on the rarest of occasions and never has happened often, ever. And for very few individuals has there ever been anything like a national day of mourning. But people sincerely in Washington understood this woman to have been an important player in the affairs of Washington, not just a lady who had nice cakes and ice cream. But Dolly Madison arrived in Washington at the beginning of something that has been called by historians and other kinds of scholars the cult of domesticity. There was a kind of rendering of the home in the American and English imagination into something like a temple. Now, a home has always been considered a very nice place, and this indeed is, for instance, a picture of a very nice home. I wouldn't mind having a room like this. But nevertheless, there was a sense that women were supposed to be there and to be essentially content with all things domestic. They were expected to stay home if they could afford to do so. Women in the colonial era had owned shops on their own, but laws began to be passed in the early 1800s that forbade women ownership of businesses. Now, some women did work in businesses their husbands or fathers owned, but it could not belong to the woman even if she had started the business with her own capital. And indeed, her own capital became the capital of her husband. If she went out and made a living, the money, every penny she made belonged to her husband, and he could do what he wanted with it. He could drink it away if he wanted to. He could spend it on hookers. She had zero legal right to the money she brought home. So she was expected to stay home and make the home a lovely place if she could afford to do that. And of course, not all women could. The cult of domesticity very much largely was aimed at the thinking of white women, you may imagine. Um, the women were supposed to see their house as their proper sphere. Um, and there was plenty to do at home. Unless you were the wealthiest of wealthy women, you had a very hard job as an American housewife. Here are just a couple of facts. Early American guidebooks for how to run a household included details like you would expect Martha Stewart to give. Um, how to throw a party, how to write a nice thank you note, how to make your own quilts and bedding, how to make a wonderful casserole, but also how to throw a funeral for your dead infant. That was just like in there, along with, Christmas parties. Why? Because 1 in 3 children died before the age of 5. And even though there were professional male doctors, there were no professional nurses, male or female. That was women's jobs. And often, if you lived at all in a rural place, and many Americans did, women were going to be the doctors. Uh, it would be good to have some good doctors on hand because that were women, because even though they didn't have medical degrees, they were your best bet of survival. Also, um, a lady who would have not owned, but lived in this sphere of this room, probably had servants, one would think. But many women didn't have servants. The majority of women in America didn't have servants, which meant that if there was a task to do, they had to do it. And this is before the microwave oven, the dishwasher, the washing machine. And I cannot even begin to tell you how hard it was to do all that work. Even in the era where women finally could have education outside the home in a formal fashion in public schools, at least until the end of high school, girls were expected to stay home 1 day a week because the washing was simply too hard to do without their mothers. And it meant that girls only got 80% of the education a boy would get at school because she was to get the task done needed, but it also was the problem of the work being so overwhelming at home and the belief that the woman would never, quote unquote, do anything with her education. It was hard to be an American housewife before there were machines to help with the job. Um, and it was hard to be the parent who might have had 6 children and lost 2. Interestingly, at this time, some discourse about housewifery, which it was often called, uh, likened it to the managing of the new nation. This woman, Mary Randolph, in her book, The Virginia Housewife, 1824, says in her book, the government of a family bears a Lilliputian resemblance to the government of a nation. And she wasn't talking about any random nation. She was talking about her nation. And while men bore the title of head of household, women tended to be the ones who really managed things within the 4 walls of the house. Truly everything. Um, this is a picture not of a colonial woman, obviously. This is the contemporary feminist thinker Gloria Steinem. And she points out that in the ancient world, there were no specialists, and women had to do every task. Women were hunters because men weren't always around, period, it seems. And while early ancient people are often with bows and arrows were thought initially in archaeological burial sites to be thought to be men simply by virtue of the fact that they had bows and arrows next to their bodies in the ritualized burial. DNA testing has allowed us to see that that wasn't true, that many women also had bows and arrows, which suggests that women hunted. They were gatherers. This surprises no one. Sculptors and painters. If there was a painting on a cave wall, it might have been done by a woman. The Venus of Willendorf, the earliest known sculpture in Europe, was quite possibly sculpted by a woman. Um, the oral traditions of these societies, the storytelling and the poetry, came from women as likely as from men. Um, they were often the religious teachers in the ancient world. They were, as they were in colonial times, the doctors and the weavers and the tailors. And in early America, particularly in the frontier, women had to do these kinds of roles as well, as much as men. Um, uh, so there was this great talk of women staying at home, but staying at home didn't mean unproactive. However, the poorer you were, the more an individual woman had to do physically. And perhaps because the work was so hard, many families hoped to marry their daughters off to somebody richer than the gentleman in their household, and there were things that were thought to be to render women eligible. Uh, Girls were generally educated at home. There were a few places, very experimental by the 1820s and 30s, that might have an educational experience outside the home for girls. They learned to read and write at home more often than not. They learned a little math, not a lot. They learned to cook, clean, and sew, unsurprisingly. And in richer families, if you're looking for a better husband than the ones in the family for a pretty girl, you might teach her more accomplishments like fine embroidery, playing a musical instrument, or painting, which were considered genteel and hence appropriate to a higher level of household. And women were taught to appear modest and humble. And they were generally discouraged from expressing any strong opinions because this might be perceived as masculine in some way. So you see this young lady quietly and modestly sewing, not even raising her eyes to the company. That was more or less the ideal for a lovely young lady who would make somebody a very good wife. But because they were so confined to these limited roles, women had to throw all their creativity into small household tasks. But in these household crafts today, we see things that are now considered because of their loveliness, um, the 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 spectacle of folk art treasures like this quilt. And as I said, the world of formal education, professionalized artistic work was closed to women. Until the 1840s, there were no post-secondary educational institutions for women at all of any kind in America. And where they opened, it was often because, for instance, I used to teach at one of those very first colleges, the College of Mount St. Vincent in the Bronx in New York, which was founded by a Catholic order of nuns that realized that they had more need for nurses that these nuns had pledged to be than they had nuns. So they decided that good Catholic girls who were not going to necessarily take vows to be nuns could also learn to be nurses because the need was very great for someone to take care of sick people, for instance, during the yellow fever epidemic in New York City. So they formalized education, but professional artistic work was closed to women. Women were supposed to have accomplishments. You could play in the parlor, but you wouldn't be invited to a concert hall as a lady. And if you did, you wouldn't accept that invitation. That would bring scandal on your family. And likewise, women authors were rarely published. You will notice that I gave you for Anne Bradstreet a video that discussed how a man took it upon himself to publish her works because a lady would never say, "Here, publish me, I'm good." That would be considered highly unladylike. And so, women in any event, their work was not considered serious. Serious subjects, and I say this putting air quotes around the word that you can't see in a recording, serious subjects would include things like warfare, heroic deeds by men of valor, um, deep philosophical, detached intellectual thoughts. These were serious works. The works related to women's lives, like the ones that you see by the writers Anne Bradstreet and other writers that we see, Harriet Beecher Stowe's first books, Louisa May Alcott's Little Women, and others as well, like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's work about the slave mother and her plaintive cry for the well-being of her child. These were not serious subjects because they involved girl stuff, basically. But so women being excluded largely from publishing in any formal fashion, they did get to write. Here is Harriet Beecher Stowe in a portrait with a book which she is writing. She wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Women wrote recipe books and household guides that they could get published. They could write performance works, plays for ladies' guilds. Women could perform for other women in a private setting, but you would never have like a music hall performance. That would be shocking. Um, and women did publish poems uh, occasionally in the newspaper, but even a great poet like Emily Dickinson only published 10 poems in her whole life in the local paper where she lived. Um, and they're included in many cookbooks. I love to pore over the old cookbooks from these eras because we see women at work in the artistic venue that they could sort of break open for themselves, limited though that was. And women wrote song lyrics, often for children because it was thought normal for a woman to teach a child a lullaby or something like that, but not exclusively so. Here are two songs that women wrote. Over the River and Through the Woods. I had to sing that at Thanksgiving in my elementary school. That was written by a woman who also wrote a book called The Frugal Housewife. And the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which is by the woman on the right of this PowerPoint slide, Julia Ward Howe, who also wrote household guides and other things wherever she could get a toehold in. There was one place, though, where almost all women wrote a little bit, and that was an embroidery sample, which I mentioned, was designed to make a woman appear marriageable. And when I say woman, I really mean little girl, because families would start looking for someone at about age 13. Maybe the wedding wouldn't take place till they were 16 or 17. But you'd want to know who in your region might be a marriageable girl for your son. And as I said, women learned how to do something like this. This is a picture I have in my house of an embroidery sample that I'm going to read to you in a second. I look at these on the wall because this was effectively women's publishing. And I look at these and I think to myself how fortunate I am that I live in an era where this isn't how I publish. And these pieces of cloth were often framed and displayed in family homes. They might be in the sitting room. And it was a way, again, to show that your daughter was an eligible bride-to-be if your son wanted to make a proposal of marriage. And they often included poems, quite often. I want to read to you what is an unexceptional poem by the person in this embroidery sample. I've got it in front of me. This is what she wrote. Those works are in vain. We hope yet heaven for to gain. This work in hand my friends may have when I am dead and in my grave. It was by a young girl named Esther Matiak, and she had this on the wall of her household. And I don't know if she married. I know that she seems not to have done additional publishing, but this was typical. And notice that it has a kind of religious idea in it, and it also talks about death. For some reason, many of these um, embroidery samplers are morbid. Think as you read Emily Dickinson how often she speaks about death. Take a look at this other embroidery sampler. This is also on the front page of the Moodle for the week. And listen to the rhythm of this short poem written by Mary Greenwood, age 11, in 1812. Religion should our thoughts engage amidst our youthful bloom. 'Twill fit us for declining age and for the awful tomb. Just keep that rhythm in this. This is Emily Dickinson. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. Boom! The prosody is the same as the works of Dickinson, and this is the first stanza of a poem by Emily Dickinson. And I just want to make this clear to you. Emily Dickinson, in high school and college, scholars used to say that Dickinson invented this astonishing new form. And the scholars that said this were men. They had discounted all the work that women had been doing for hundreds of years as they read these poems and decided, wow, this is brand new. She never had anybody before her do anything like this at all, they would say. And I think you yourselves at this moment now know that not to be true. Emily Dickinson takes an American folk art tradition in which she was a participant. She had to make samplers like this and invent a new way of writing poems for the page. I believe that for her audience of her era, these stylistic conceits would have been recognizable, though the scholars who are divided from the era of the embroidery sample by decades, if not a century, who write the scholarly papers on Dickinson that I had to read as a college student, they didn't read those things in their grandma's house, if it indeed they saw them up. What Emily Dickinson is doing is very interesting. She approaches the page like an element of traditional feminine craft. Men do not approach a page as if they were embroidering, at least not traditionally, they don't. They learn to write in a schoolhouse, traditionally. Girls learn to write at home. They also learn to embroider at home. And what you see here is the flap of an envelope on which Emily Dickinson has inscribed a short poem. The novelist Jane Austen, who I teach in British literature, and I totally recommend you read Jane Austen. She is such a cool novelist. I want to hang out with her when I get a time machine. She's funny. She's cool. She has a lot of interesting observations about the world, and she paints a picture of a world very vividly with all of its problems. She pins together, as she's writing these novels, portions of her text as if she were crafting a new dress pattern. Patterns were made of paper. You would pin them together. She's pinning pieces of Pride and Prejudice together. OMFG, I say, because that means she's doing something. She's not just kicking it old school, she's kicking it old girl school. I mean, seriously, it's amazing she did that. Emily Dickinson wrote what would later be called envelope poems. To your left, you see it, requiring her to be as brief as a flap of an envelope might contain, a sampler of words almost. And the poem pictured here is not in her collections, nor is it considered one of her greater works. I'm not so into the poem particularly, but it illustrates her non-academic approach to writing. Again, boys learn to write in the schoolhouse traditionally. Girls learn at home. They also learn to make dress patterns. They do write little letters to each other, little thank you notes and such. They also embroider. And these are the things that inform the work of Emily Dickinson. And I don't think that's irrelevant. I think that that matters. I do want to make it clear that not everybody who embroidered was anywhere on the planet of as good as Emily Dickinson. She has an exceptional, world class, for the ages, OMG, wish I could write as well as her every day talent. What she does with that little tiny space, like the envelope or the sampler, is she fills that space with enormous, complex meaning. Every little poem looks deceptively simple, but it is like, you remember when you have like the box where the snake pops out, or the jack in the box pops out and he looks like he's bigger than what would even fit in the box? Her poems are so packed, it's like they explode out with meaning. Uh, she isn't just embroidering samplers on the page. It's not that simple. That first one I read to you, meh. I mean, I hope she found a good husband, that girl who had to make that poem. Nothing special about it. But Dickinson is doing something world class. Um, what she does too is part of American modernism. She is considered a proto-modern poet because she is operating in what is called minimalism. She has so little space, she allows herself to write a thing, and she makes everything deep happen in just a few lines. Um, Poets don't really do that en masse until significantly later in American history. You'll notice that Walt Whitman's poems are quite long. The poems of the 19th century are generally long. In the mid 20th century, we start to see modern writers speaking more briefly in a minimalistic style, like Dickinson's. And she isn't the inventor of American poetry. And in fact, we could argue that because she is relying so heavily on a long-standing tradition of women's arts, she's not so much inventing as adapting something important. But she certainly contributes to the reinvention of poetry in the New World with this minimalistic approach. This is a picture of a very young Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, a book that is often credited as being a very important influence on gaining people into the abolitionist movement, and ending the possibility of calling slavery moral. She contributes to the events leading up to the Civil War. Um, and Harriet Beecher Stowe writes a guidebook, a household guidebook, with her sister that includes, cooking tips and how do you do an herb garden and how do you get muck that's on the bottom of a pot that sticks really hard. She recommended oyster shells to scrape them off. Remember, there's no intensive cleaners beyond what the sort of the all natural ingredients would bear. But she and her sister also have a chapter on what should be done about women gaining equality because they are feminists. And they suggest that women need equality, and they need financial equality and political equality. And what she wants is that rather than offering women entrance into places like medical school or the army, women should be paid on par with men and trained within traditional women's arts in a professionalized and fully compensated manner. She thought if you pay somebody really well for what is the most important job in society, arguably raising children, and you give them full autonomy over that money, and you give them political power like the vote, which Harriet Beecher Stowe didn't have, then that could work out and men and women could keep in their lanes professionally, and that would be cool, she thought. Um, and I want to say how she did this. She was surely informed by her experience of riding Uncle Tom's Cabin. She wrote it on her kitchen table. She had like 4 kids yanking at her skirts, going, "Mommy, mommy, mommy!" And while she's writing the best-selling novel of 100 years, Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's not a great book. I didn't include it in um, this class, but we should all be as rich as Harriet Beecher Stowe from our work. Because OMG, she was all J.K. Rowling rich. She was like seriously Harry Potter rich. And she wrote this book while she was tending her multiple children and rolling out pie crusts on her kitchen table, and she often had to dust the flour off her drafts, I should say. That's a typo. She was blowing flour off the paper she was sending to the publisher. Uh, that's not the way men generally write. And today we think of feminism largely as the inclusion of women in what were traditionally men's activities. Women can be president. Women can be astronauts. Women can be pilots. Women can fight in wars. Women can be great athletes. Women can do all kinds of things. And indeed, women can. But that was not the vision that this lady you see pictured to the left had of what equality might look like. And some early feminists thought that making women economically and politically powerful on par with men in their own traditional home activities would work just as well. I think it's an interesting idea. It surprised me when I read. Contemporary capitalism has largely prevented this possibility from being seriously considered. First of all, until we are willing to pay kindergarten teachers what we pay investment bankers, we probably cannot sufficiently valorize economically traditional women's activities. Women deal with 5-year-olds all day. Guys who get the leverage for a hostile takeover from the world financial markets tend to make a million, billion, gazillion times more than the kindergarten teacher who helps hundreds of people throughout her career become better human beings. Furthermore, too many women have entered the worlds traditionally occupied by men and have proven themselves as good at men at those activities. There are women investment bankers. Maybe they don't want to be kindergarten teachers. Maybe they don't want to embroider samplers. Maybe they want to play sports for the Olympics. Maybe they want to be pole vaulters. And so Gloria Steinem, the contemporary thinker I included the photograph of, suggests that men might fully embrace traditional women's activities as part of this revolution. Certainly many more men are becoming nurses. Beyond that, though, maybe men could understand nurturing as a central activity of their lives the way that traditional homemakers have who are women. It's a possibility. I'm not telling anyone, male or female, what to do with his or her life, but it is an interesting thought, and who knows what's going to happen next? I certainly don't. In any case, I wanted to show you this because I think it helps you rethink traditional life better and to think about who we might become in the future. And whatever else is true, um, the traditionally women made half of our national crafts remain worthy of our admiration. There is nothing more American than apple pie, especially a well-made one, and a beautiful quilt in red, white, and blue. I feel like it's time to ask the band to play God Bless America. In any case, I hope you found this lecture helpful in your study of Dickinson and your understanding of women's roles in the colonial and post-colonial era of the United States.